Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
Today we bring you a special edition of Bookshelf. As with Christmas and New Year almost upon us, we thought it'd be a good moment to look back over all the books we've read and discussed this past year and see if we can't pick a favourite. The best book club book of 2018.
Are we going to agree? I'm almost certain that we're not. But we'll see.
Oh, well.
Let's find out.
Well, let's find out.
So we have two stacks of books in front of us, one for each book club, my book club and Laura's book club, and each the subject of an episode over the past 12 months. So Laura, what have you got in front of you?
Well, I have, in no particular order actually, Two Serious Ladies by Jane Bowles, Swing Time by Zadie Smith, Do Not Say We Have Nothing by Madeleine Thien, Educated by Tara Westover, and The House of Impossible Beauties by Joseph Cassara. And actually, just squeaking in, the subject of our next episode, we have Lullaby by Leila Slemani.
And for me, it's Call Me By Your Name by Aciman, A Horse Walks Into a Bar by David Grossman, Dr. Fischer of Geneva, or The Bomb Party by Greene, East West Street by Philippe Sands, A Far Cry from Kensington by Muriel Spark, The Faraway Nearby by Rebecca Solnit, Less by Andrew Sean Greer, and The Unfinished Palazzo by Judith Mackrell. That's a lot of books.
It is quite a lot of books. I feel a sense of accomplishment.
It's funny, when we had to put this list together, I was sort of thinking about it. I was thinking, oh gosh, what did we read? What did we read? If only I had some list. If only I kept a list. And suddenly I was like, hang on a minute. There's a podcast.
Yes, that is what I went back to.
Me too. But it's funny because I was having a chat with a friend of mine actually, and she was saying after she finishes every book, she makes a note in her little book journal of what she thought of that book. And I was like, oh, I guess that's so brilliant. I should really do that. I find that really hard. I've tried to keep book diaries in the past and I've never really managed it. I think because the second I finish a book, I basically want to move on to the next one. And then I realised, of course, the podcast has effectively become my book journal. So
Absolutely.
I do have a book journal.
Indeed. And even our Instagram has, for the past, 12 months or so, been documenting the books we've read most recently. Yeah. So you can go back to that as well.
Yeah, it's all very satisfying.
It is very satisfying.
I've really achieved something in my life.
By reading books.
So of these books, casting our minds back, I think the first ones we did actually, going by the list, was Two Serious Ladies and A Horse Walks Into a Bar. I remember Two Serious Ladies mainly because of how much we disliked it. And we weren't really convinced by it as a book club book either, were we? It wasn't really a great discussion.
No, it is a mad, strange book. So Jane Bowles was married to Paul Bowles, I believe. And the two of them are these, I don't know, minor celebrities in the sort of bohemian 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 50s scene. They were married, but they both had same-sex relationships throughout their marriage, and they ended up living in Morocco, and they were fascinating people. And at some point, Jane Bowles, who apparently didn't have any other writing in her past, decided she would write a novel, and that was Two Serious Ladies.
I'm not sure. I think maybe there was screenplays or theatre. I think she did write other things.
I think she was just surrounded by this incredible creative milieu and was like, I could write a novel. Why don't I write a novel? And then just jotted down this absolutely bonkers stream of consciousness book about two serious ladies, who meet at the very beginning, and then their lives diverge, and the stories completely diverge until the end, where they end up back together in a bar. And it's just a string of events. My book club was very nonplussed.
Yeah.
We were really excited about it because it is this cult classic. And then we read it and we're like, I just don't think she ever reread it. I think it was stream of consciousness. She sat down, wrote a book, never edited it, probably never reread it. And people rave about it.
And not just anybody, but, people who you've heard of, who you think, wow, well, if that person liked it, I can't remember, it was Truman Capote.
A modern legend, says Truman Capote, which may be true of Jane Bowles, but not of the book. And Ali Smith, I think, loved it. I would like to say that after 11 odd months or so...
Has it grown on you?
No, because it's not even very well written. No. So, I'm sorry, Jane Bowles. You may have been fascinating, and I might love to read a biography about you. But I can't recommend Two Serious Ladies as a read or as a book club book.
No, I think I rather concur with that one. And then we come on to A Horse Walks Into a Bar, which was also quite a difficult read. Again, quite highly rated. It won the Man Booker International Prize. It's by David Grossman, who's an Israeli writer. It's a book about a stand-up comedian, and obviously it's a very famous opening to an incredibly well-known joke, so you immediately think, oh, this is going to be funny. And it's so far from funny. And that wouldn't be a problem. I think it was well written. It was very atmospheric. I think the problem was that he almost creates this atmosphere where it's as if you're a person in the room witnessing this stand-up show and you really, really want to leave. And that just made it quite hard to read, because certainly with my book club, we didn't feel it made us want to read on, and there wasn't anything really compelling that made us want to finish it, and there certainly wasn't anything funny about it. But I don't think he intended it as that.
No, I don't think he didn't intend it to be funny. It was supposed to be a man coming undone on stage. And you'll remember he has invited a former friend from his childhood to sort of bear witness to this performance. And there's the implication that there might be some other people in the audience who's invited to kind of bear witness to his mental breakdown. And so it's him going back over his childhood, his relationships with his parents, the damage that had been done to his mother as a result of the persecution during the Holocaust. And I do remember you saying that, I think it was Amanda, felt that it was a very poignant encapsulation of the collective damage that the Holocaust had inflicted on a whole generation of individuals who then moved to Israel for a fresh start, but of course couldn't leave that behind them. And the collective trauma.
Even once they were there in Israel, they were then sort of beleaguered, set upon by all sides. There was Arab war and to this day.
So this real survivor mindset. And for that reason, this book has stuck with me. I hated reading it. I did not enjoy it. But I've never read anything else like it. And I think it is powerful.
Absolutely true. And he is an amazing writer. And I think I was quite disappointed by this because I had expected to love it. I've read other things by him that I thought were extraordinary. So for me, this was just a bit of a disappointment. Felt like a bit of a misfire. Was it a good book club book? I don't remember the discussion being particularly animated. I'm not sure it was such a good book club book.
I think it is a good book, though, and I would recommend it if you can bear it. You won't know until you start, of course. So maybe one for the library. But it has grown on me.
Do not say we have nothing. I remember quite fondly, because I remember that you and I were very much at odds with, it was your book club who read it, wasn't it?
It was my book club who read it.
And I was on your side. And
Yes. So I read this book. Madeleine Thien is a Canadian novelist. And Do Not Say We Have Nothing is about, well, 20th century Chinese history is one way to put it. But it's about the lives of one family across 50 to, probably more. It starts off during the Civil War in China, so the 1920s, 1930s, and then it has the Communist Revolution, then it has the Cultural Revolution, and then the key character in the present in Vancouver is trying to uncover what happened to her father during the Cultural Revolution. And I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. My book club did not agree at all.
Well, it was quite hard to read, wasn't it? Because it was quite alienating. There was a sort of distance to it. It felt like the characters weren't fully rounded. It was really quite hard to engage with it. But what was so brilliant about it, and it was quite a long book, was that the closer you got to the resolution, the more all the pieces started to fall into place, and you understood why it had been written in that way. And that felt really extraordinary. Like she'd taken you on a journey to a point where suddenly you really inhabited that world and you understood what was going on. I think that's what was really impressive about that book. But I can see definitely why people might struggle with it. It wasn't an easy read.
I know. And my book club received a text message from me on holiday. And I was like, gosh, I just breezed through this book. You know, it's such a page turner.
Except for Laura. Laura found it an easy read.
And they all arrived and were like, what are you talking about? But it is very beautifully written. I don't think anyone could contest that.
Well, and also I'm sure your book club will be absolutely up in arms at my suggesting that, you know, they're only up for easy reads. It's not that, you know.
No, not at all. It might not be the best book club book, arguably.
It's long.
It is long. It is dense. And I think it's a shame when people don't make it to the end of a book club book. Even if they hate it. It's nice when everyone can finish it, think it through, and then debate and discuss it. So not, perhaps, we're kind of going to give ourselves away here, but not the best book club book of the year.
That's true.
We should probably not be so definitive in our feedback.
But maybe it was.
But maybe, yeah, who knows? Wait and see.
Educated by Tara Westover.
Well, another one of mine. A wonderful book.
It was a wonderful book. I had read it already before
right.
your book club came to it. I had been drawn to it just because I spent some time in Idaho when I was younger, and she's from Idaho.
As you do.
As you do.
And you're English. You grew up in the English countryside.
It was very random, but I lived in Idaho for a year. And I just remember reading it on the sofa. I had the baby not long before, so I remember we were sort of, you know, snuggled up and sort of feeding, and I absolutely roared through it. It was great. I was so gripped. It was so well written. Such an interesting story. Yeah, I loved it.
I loved it too. My book club loved it. If you haven't heard the premise of it, I don't know where you've been, but basically Tara Westover is probably now in her 30s and a Cambridge PhD, which is an accomplishment in and of itself, but made much more so when you discover that she had absolutely no formal education until the age of 18. And it's not just that she was homeschooled, she really wasn't schooled at all. She grew up in a survivalist, fundamentalist Mormon family in the mountains of Idaho, and her parents just didn't teach the children. They were isolationist and very suspicious of government and society, and Tara just kind of ran free. Ran free sounds idyllic. It was not an idyllic upbringing at all. It was marred by violence and misogyny.
And danger.
Danger,
forced to work in this scrapyard, wielding heavy machinery at a very young age, and they were not looked after. They were not really taken care of. They were exposed to a lot of danger. It's partly amazing that she survived, but then this extraordinary story of how she did find her way to education, and then how that just gave her the tools she needed to just fly away from this life.
It's a really powerful book, and it's not just that incredible story. She is a fantastic writer.
Now, I have a point to make about Educated. I should know, actually. I've worked in publishers. I know what they're like. I love the cover of Educated, which is this wonderful illustration of a pencil nib. And then when you look more closely at the pencil, you realise that it's actually mountains, and there's a tiny figure standing there in silhouette, and you realise it's a girl, standing in the middle of this mountainous landscape. It's beautiful. It's so well executed. It perfectly encapsulates the main ideas in this book, and I just loved it so much. And then for the paperback edition, the publishers have decided, which has now come out, publishers have decided to go for this really terrible picture of her that must be something that she supplied them with. So maybe, this is something that she was on board with. But it's just a sort of generic photo of a child sitting on a swing in a kind of playground somewhere in what vaguely looks like an urban setting. And when I looked at it, I was like, oh, right, that's like kind of branded now as a sort of standard childhood misery memoir. I see what they've done there. And I was just like, this is so disappointing, and this wonderful, wonderful book, which had this wonderful, wonderful cover. And now it's got this sort of generic, it's not, totally awful, but it just, as a book designer, I felt like that was such a shame.
That may well be the cover that I have on my edition, but I can't remember because the cover of my edition is so unmemorable.
Yeah.
I just remember muted greys and blues.
So shout out to whoever designed the original cover of Educated. I'm so sorry I didn't have time to look up and find out who you are, but I think you're a genius.
One of the next books of your book club, Dr. Fischer of Geneva, or The Bomb Party by Graham Greene.
Now, I'd never read any Graham Greene, and Dr. Fischer of Geneva was certainly not the book to convert me to his charms.
It's very short.
It's a novella. It's quite a contrived story about a man who...
A misanthrope.
Marries
that's a good word for him.
A younger woman, and he lives in Switzerland. And it turns out that the younger woman who he's desperately in love with has this sort of evil father. So he has an evil father-in-law, Dr. Fischer, who has these kind of strange, surreal dinner parties where he invites guests for the purpose of tormenting them, really. And he's incredibly rich, so everyone is desperate to maintain this connection with this man, despite the fact that he sort of kind of socially abuses them whenever they come round.
It's a ritual humiliation.
Yes, but the trouble was we just found it very dated. We didn't particularly engage with the writing. We weren't invested enough in the characters, and we didn't really believe the threat or the danger. At one point he makes his guests eat porridge, and we thought, well, that's not that bad.
Cold porridge,
yeah.
Kate.
The cold porridge. There's a sort of denouement, and I suppose I didn't mind that so much, actually. I was sort of one of the few people in my book club who didn't see it coming, because that's just me. I never see things coming. But everyone else is like, oh, for goodness sake, it's telegraphed a mile off this ending. So the general discussion was actually much more about Graham Greene and whether it's important to read Graham Greene and what we think about Graham Greene. People who have read more Greene were citing there are some books of his that are sort of the real classics, and they are really good, and they are the ones you should read. But he wrote this, I think this is one of the last things he ever wrote, and he was quite old by this stage, and I think it just showed, really. There wasn't much to it.
Yeah, I've read it, and there wasn't much to it. It was fairly unmemorable.
Sally has continued to campaign for Graham Greene, and in our book club Lucky Dip, she gave me another Graham Greene novel. I want to say The Comedians. Does that sound like it would be a Graham Greene?
That sounds like it could be.
I couldn't be 100% sure. I had a couple of drinks by then, and now it's sitting on my coffee table. Anyway, she's still most keen that I should read Graham Greene. So Sally, if you're listening, I will give that a try.
Another classic, though, on your list, A Far Cry from Kensington by Muriel Spark.
I think we picked this because the Guardian book club had done it, and it got this sort of lovely write-up. You know, they'd all sort of really enjoyed it, and it's an insider view of the publishing industry, and a lot of us are connected with the publishing world, so we thought we'd enjoy that. So we were sort of expecting a treat, and it was okay.
I'm a big fan of Muriel Spark. I'm definitely a convert. I started with A Far Cry from Kensington, and then I went on to read The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, which is obviously her most famous novel. And there is a coldness to her writing. I think we talked about that a lot, but it's so good. She's
sharp.
So sharp. She's an excellent writer, a real craftsman in her phrasing and her light touch characterization. I remember A Far Cry from Kensington irked some of your book club members because it's meant to be a farce, right?
Well, yes, and I just don't like farce. I can't think of any farcical books that I do enjoy, with possible exception of the P.G. Wodehouse novels. Yes, and that bothered me. And I think one of the main things is because it's like, if it's farce, it seems to be this sort of tacit understanding that you don't have to bother to develop any of your characters, because it doesn't really matter. They're like the roles in Cluedo, you know, they exist just to serve your plot, and that's fine. And that's just not enough for me, you know. I just need more. If I'm going to invest my time in reading something, you know, I need more than that. But it was a good discussion book, and I remain intrigued by Muriel Spark, and we did a lovely interview with the Muriel Spark Book Club, which runs out of the Edinburgh Waterstones. And that I found really inspiring, and what I kind of took away from that, because she wrote so many novels, is that they're all often very different. And I just thought, oh gosh, you know, it's worth reading more of her. And I've since read Memento Mori by her, which I really enjoyed. That's my favourite one of hers that I've read so far. And I have The Girls of Slender Means also by my bedside, which Amanda, who came on the show, really recommended. So yeah, there are lots of her books, and I think I was pleased to have read her, and I'm definitely intrigued enough to want to carry on reading. But was it the best book club book? Who can say?
We're trying to be coy here, guys. Next up, The Faraway Nearby, Rebecca Solnit.
Yes, that was my book club, wasn't it? That was an Andy recommendation. He'd read it, really liked it, wanted us to read it. And it was a sort of memoir, anti-memoir.
It was an anti-memoir.
We discussed the new to us genre of anti-memoir. An anti-memoir is when the writer is exploring a subject, but in a way that makes the reader think about and reflect on themselves. And it's totally true to say that that's what's going on in this book. You're reading about her life and her thoughts and events that happened to her. But it really does then provoke you to think about parallels in your own life or your own experience in quite a beautiful way. It was beautifully written, very artfully structured. I kind of loved it, but it wasn't a universal crowd pleaser.
If you haven't heard of Rebecca Solnit, you probably will have heard of the phrase mansplaining.
Yes, from her book Men Explain Things to Me and Other Stories, which is a collection of short essays, which I had read a long time ago, actually, before mansplaining ever really took off.
And that
she sort of coined that term originally.
And that rather launched her into this sort of feminist literary icon in the US and beyond. And rightfully so, because she is such a brilliant writer and has a very fierce intellect, but still writes in quite a meandering way. There's a lot of etymology where she kind of riffs for 2 pages on the root word behind another word and takes you on a journey into that word, which I'm sure lots of people would love. Didn't quite do it for me. I was much more intrigued in her practical experiences, say, you know, enjoying contemporary art or exploring Iceland, or indeed her relationship with her mother. But that sort of scattered throughout these musings. I guess that's the nature of an anti-memoir. You don't quite get what you want in terms of understanding that person's life.
I remember Amanda came up with the classic line that summed up that book, which is, it was the interior monologue that we'd all like to have, but sadly we don't.
Yes,
but
absolutely.
I kind of loved it. For me, it felt like going on a journey, but an internal journey, both through her mind and then, you know, sort of trying to follow in my own way. But
my friend Frances, having listened to that episode, brought me Wanderlust.
Have you managed to read that?
I have not managed to read that, but I have it on my bookshelf, and Wanderlust is probably quite a similar book in the same sense that it interweaves Solnit's life and the lives of walkers, because so many artists, scientists, great minds have loved walking, I think, as a way to kind of free up the mind as you free up the body. And that's right up my alley because I love a good walk. but haven't got to it yet. That is the thing about Solnit. She's not a page turner. So she's always there waiting for you, but you actually need to commit.
Yeah, I was pleased to have read her. Thanks, Andy, for recommending her.
Yeah, Andy is a very classy man. He's got very good taste.
How about Call Me By Your Name by Andre Aciman? I have very fond memories of that, mainly because we had lovely Phil from your book club, who was such a delight, and I just remember that as being a really funny show where I just laughed so much. But what about the book? Never mind about Phil.
Never mind about lovely Phil. Call Me By Your Name. People have heard of it now because it was made into a film, an Oscar-nominated film. It was released to much critical acclaim, and it is a beautiful film. The book is, I would say, even more beautiful. Andre Aciman is an American writer. He is a straight man, and he set himself the challenge, as I understand it, of writing about kind of a great love story between two men. And it is a pretty wonderful love story. I say that, of course. A lot of people in my book club are like, oh my God, it's just teenage infatuation. Because the main character, Elio, is in love, obsessed with this beautiful American graduate student who is staying at his family's villa on the coast of Italy. And I remember someone else saying it's like aggressively bourgeois, because it is, you know, they just live this idyllic existence.
I mean, I have to say that's what I liked about it. And I think if it had been set in another milieu, I wouldn't have been nearly as interested. What I loved was that sense of this wealthy, middle-class European life full of culture and ancient palazzos and rooms piled with wonderful books and music and art and people having conversations about music and art in 3 different languages around the table. And I just loved all that.
All the while with, you know, sex bubbling away beneath the surface.
I could have taken all out of the sex, but I mean, you know, it was certainly interesting, and it was slightly eye-opening for me, in a way that actually less the other, or one of the later novels that we read, which is a wonderful, very sweet comic novel, beautifully constructed. It won the Pulitzer Prize, which is why we read it, by Andrew Sean Greer. But that treats homosexual relationships in almost like a more prosaic way. I wasn't in any way sort of shocked or taken. I wasn't shocked by Call Me By Your Name, but I certainly, there were times where I found it a bit like, oh, you know.
But you know what? I don't think it's because it was gay sex. It was just quite full on sex, full stop. You know, authors will kind of steer away from the bodily functions involved in sex. Not Andre Aciman. For everyone who's read it, you know, there's the peach scene.
The peach.
And if you haven't read it, you'll know when you get to the peach.
You never feel quite the same way about a peach after you see that or read that.
That actually makes me think we've read 3 books through our book clubs this year that center on gay men at different points. Well, I say in history, not really in history, but just very, very different scenes.
Yeah.
So we have Call Me By Your Name, which I think was set in the 1980s or so.
Yeah, maybe.
It's very unclear. They like to keep it a bit hazy.
Yeah.
And then we read Less, which is set in pretty much the present, and it's about minor literary novelist
Arthur Less,
who's kind of going through a midlife crisis after his lover leaves him to get married to someone else, and he decides he's going to tour the world and feel sorry for himself, even though everyone tells him it is ridiculous for him to feel sorry for himself. That book did grow on me. You'll remember I really struggled to get into it. I was reading it on a holiday and it just felt a bit light, and I unfairly, I would say, likened it to Eat, Pray, Love because, you know, the premise is somewhat similar. But it stayed with me. It's very smart and very funny.
It was brilliantly written. It's probably my most recommended book. When I've been talking about books that we've done, that's the one I say, oh, you should read it. I think you'd really enjoy it. It was just a lovely, fun read, but also thought-provoking and, yeah, sort of the theme about aging and the things that make life meaningful. I thought he sort of wove all that in really nicely. So, yeah, for me, that was quite a life-enhancing read.
What did your book club think of it?
We all liked it, and there was good discussion about it, but I think we were a little bit underwhelmed considering it had won this Pulitzer Prize. So then we had quite a good discussion about the Pulitzer Prize and what that means, and you know, should we care about the Pulitzer Prize? And yeah, I remember that was sort of our main reaction. Yeah, it's a very hard book not to like. I can't quite imagine anyone really ripping it to pieces. You know, it's just too sweet, and it's well written and well constructed. And
I do think awards can be quite hard on books, don't you?
It's quite reductive, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's quite difficult for them to kind of shoulder the weight of the award, whether it's a Booker or a Pulitzer.
I thought you meant like trying to come up with our best book club book of the year.
No.
No, yes, wars in general. Yeah.
The other book we read, centered around gay men was The House of Impossible Beauties by Joseph Cassara, which I came to with extremely high hopes. It is the first novel by Joseph Cassara, who's probably in his 20s, 30s. And it reads like a first novel, says Laura scathingly. It is about the drag ball scene in New York in the 1980s. And
Laura, what's the main problem with The House of Impossible Beauties, given that it's about the drag ball scene in 1980s New York?
There aren't enough drag balls.
Not enough drag balls.
Only one drag ball, in fact. Otherwise, it's...
Or Joseph Cassara. If you just put in more drag balls, Laura might have been happy.
Which is a bit unfair, because the reality is that the characters' lives outside of the drag balls were very bleak, and I think that's actually what Joseph Cassara is exploring, is the terrible circumstances these very young individuals were forced into because they were not accepted at home, and they came to New York, maybe as young as 13, 14, and were very vulnerable.
And this is a book based on a film that documented this scene as it existed in New York. It's called Paris is Burning. So it's a novel, it's fiction, but he's very much bringing to life this time and this place and these people as they were. And I was definitely in the kind of, I liked this book camp. I thought it was vivid, vibrant. I cared about the characters. He drew me in. I sort of loved exploring this completely unknown world, these completely unknown people, and having that experience of getting to sort of inhabit their minds for a bit.
And this is a funny one because it was a small book club group. There was only 5 of us, I think, and none of us liked it that much. We were all a bit not but we were receiving messages from people and they were like, I loved it. You know, at least 4 other people loved it and just couldn't make the discussion. So I can't say it wouldn't be a good book club book. It just wasn't good for us because we didn't kind of have the disparate points of view and the debate that would have resulted.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, definitely. I was pleased to have read it. What else have we got? East West Street, did we talk about that? On the Origins of Genocide and Crimes Against Humanity by Philippe Sands. Not on the face of it, a barrel of laughs.
I remember your book club choosing this and I thought... Oh my God. I struggle with upsetting topics. It can really send me into dark funks for weeks at a time.
In this book, Philippe Sands, who is a barrister who specialises in human rights law, is exploring these 2 lawyers, Lauterpacht and Lemkin, who were responsible for bringing into the legal framework the terms crimes against humanity and genocide. This was due to the Nuremberg war trials that happened after the Second World War. Previously, these phrases had not been used in a legal sense. So it sounds a bit dry, but he weaves in his own family history.
And there's a great coincidence at the heart of the story, which is that Lauterpacht, Lemkin, and Philippe Sands' grandfather were all Jews from the same small city on the border of Ukraine and Poland. Lvov. Or...
how do you pronounce it? And it had various names because it kept changing hands in history. Philippe Sands, I just think, is amazing.
Oh my God.
He writes for the Financial Times. I think he has a column. I just would read or listen to anything he writes or wants to say.
I'm so excited that he exists. Yeah. Like right now on this planet, I'm like, a genius walks among us.
I just think he's someone who is sort of fiercely intelligent and very articulate, but also there's just kind of this sort of great heart there and desire to do good and do the right thing and to try and show other people the way, I think, that it's hard not to respond to. And this is a book, as I understand it from interviews with him, and we talked about this when we discussed it, he originally wrote his manuscript and then he took it to his editor at his publishers in New York, who said, fine, but we're not going to publish it like this. You have to take it apart. You have to structure it like this, and this is how you tell the story. And if you tell it this way, by the time you get to the crucial moment of the trials at the end, your audience will understand and they'll follow you and they'll know where you are and why it matters. And so he went away and I think took another sort of 2 years to rewrite everything. But it really shows. It's just so brilliantly structured and it's well written and it doesn't flag. It's well paced. He carries you along. This devastating subject, but he somehow makes it readable and fascinating. And I thought this was a wonderful book.
I think it's a wonderful book. I listened to it and Philippe Sands narrates it and he has a fantastic voice. I could listen to him all day. Yeah. So funnily enough, I say that, and actually my colleague has decided Philippe Sands has the sexiest voice of all time because I turned her on to the Rat Line.
What's
which
that?
is Philippe. Oh my God, have we not talked about this?
No.
Philippe Sands has done a podcast series
Right.
with the BBC called The Rat Line, and it picks up after the Nuremberg trials and traces the escape of a senior Nazi who had been responsible. He was a civil servant in quote marks, but he had been sort of a civil servant in occupied Poland, and he escaped prosecution. And so The Rat Line is Philippe Sands trying to find out what happened to him. But Philippe Sands is quite good friends with the son of this senior Nazi. And they have this strange relationship where they're both trying to change each other's minds. Because the son of this senior Nazi doesn't believe that his father was actually responsible. He says, no, my father was just a civil servant. He wasn't involved. He wasn't in the Gestapo. It wasn't under his remit. And they have a friendship, which is really powerful because it just shows the humanity, I think, of both sides. And Philippe Sands very much wants to kind of unpick what it is that turns good family men, I'm going to say, but anyone, you know, people who can be loving and caring to their family, turns them into cold-blooded murderers. And for me, this book is so powerful because there's just this tide of hate rising around the world right now, and people constantly dehumanizing the people around them just because they're different. So it's really scary. And Philippe Sands, I think in The Rat Line, comments on the fact that there are far-right Nazi deniers marching right now in Eastern Europe. You know, it doesn't go away. So a fantastic book, full stop. Was it a good book club book?
It was. Yeah, we had a good discussion. So much to say. We often come up with this with non-fiction. It's almost like with non-fiction, it's then so much about the subject and the way the author tells the story. And it doesn't have that subjectivity that fiction has. So, funnily enough, I think non-fiction can make for very good book club books because it's somehow slightly more neutral and you can have these really animated discussions without maybe people feeling too personally about it. It was a great book anyway. I think it was a great discussion book and I was really pleased we'd read it. It was slightly long, but I remember, I think most people finished it.
And I listened to it and couldn't stop listening to it. I went for a walk one day, I think on a Saturday, and just had it on for 2 hours.
Yeah, it definitely had a really compulsive quality.
It's a bit of a mystery as well, because he doesn't know that much about his own grandfather, who escaped Nazi persecution and hid in Paris for the duration of the war. And so unpicking that story and who his grandfather was is gripping, regardless of everything else that's happening too. Swing Time by Zadie Smith.
Zadie Smith.
Such a great writer.
It was your book club choice, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yes. I wanted to like this so much, and I'd read other things by her, and I'd always found them a bit problematic, her other novels. I love her voice. I love the way she writes. But
that's
for me,
why I said such a great writer.
Yeah, they just don't really hang together. I didn't feel it was sustained. And actually with this, with Swing Time, I thought as a novel, the way it was crafted, for me, it worked quite well. But I just didn't buy some of the characters. I was incredibly invested in the main relationship, which is this unnamed narrator and her childhood friend, Tracy. And their great passion is dance, particularly Tracy. It's really the thing that she lives for. And they're from a fairly poor background. There's a very charismatic mother figure who's sort of always studying political tracts and becomes politically very active. And that relationship was also really fascinating. So that side of it, I was incredibly invested in. I really enjoyed. But then there's this other thread to do with the celebrity and sort of, you know, going to Africa and
basically Madonna.
Yeah, kind of maybe. And I didn't really think that worked. I didn't really believe in the characters. I didn't really buy the story. So unfortunately, as with every other Zadie Smith novel I've ever read, for me it didn't quite work. But it's a shame. And I ended up thinking, we talked about her essays, Feel Free. There's an essay collection that came out this year by her, which I read and just loved. And I think for me, if you want to read Zadie Smith, that's the way to go. But was it a good book club book?
Well, that is the question. I think it was a really good book club book, actually. I think there's a lot to discuss there. I don't think it's a perfect novel. I think Zadie Smith is a brilliant writer. I'm not sure she's mastered story. I don't know. The plots that she weaves can be quite complex, but they don't really hang together. You're not really taken on a full journey. You kind of get bashed about a bit and you're like, why are we here now? And this narrator becomes the assistant to this pop star, Madonna. She travels to an unnamed African nation and does philanthropic work before she comes back to London. And it's a bit all over the place. I did really enjoy it. I think there was a lot to discuss. But in the way that fiction, especially flawed fiction, can give you a lot more to discuss than the perfect novel.
Yes, I see that.
And I will keep reading Zadie Smith because I have high hopes.
I know, and how could I possibly, I don't want to ever say anything critical of Zadie Smith. Such an interesting writer, such an interesting figure, but yeah, this just didn't really work for me.
One final book.
The Unfinished Palazzo.
That's the book.
Again, non-fiction. 3 women, 1 palazzo in Venice. Luisa Casati, who was a wealthy Italian marchesa. Doris Castle Ross, who was a London socialite, sort of social climber, and Peggy Guggenheim, who, of course, eventually moved there, bought the palazzo, and now, to this day, it houses her collection. It's the Guggenheim Museum. And this is by Judith Mackrell, and it weaves together the stories of these 3 women, with the palazzo being the point that links them all together. I think one of the comments in my book club was just that, it wasn't really enough about the palazzo. We would have liked more palazzo, but, I thought it was incredibly atmospheric, and I loved the way that she, in quite a tactile way, she managed to bring the worlds that these women lived in, these incredibly luxurious, very expensive worlds where, it was quite epic amounts of spending sort of went on.
Gorgeous costume balls most of the time.
Costume balls or brilliant, bright young things, dancing on the terrace with Noel Coward in one corner and
Doris Castle-Ross in the next.
And then Peggy Guggenheim and her art and the collection of artists and intellectuals who gathered around her there. It's also a story, I think, about these women and about their position in society, their vulnerability as they grew older and their resources dried up. That's really interesting. One of the things I liked very much about it was that it was this, in some ways, very straightforward biography, but she wove in all these really interesting ideas. I found myself reflecting on lots of other things.
Without being heavy-handed about it.
Yes. It was sort of lightly done and well done.
Yeah, it was almost incidental that you began to think about the life choices they had to make or did make because they didn't have many other options available to them.
Yeah, it was a really interesting read and quite compulsive. Again, it had a real page-turning quality. It sort of gathered momentum, and I think the main comment with my book club was people struggle with the first section, which is about Luisa Casati, because it's just that bit longer and it's very dense, it's very packed with information, and I think after a while you get a bit overwhelmed by the detail. But then if you sort of push on through and you get to Doris and then Peggy and you just sort of romp your way to the end, and it was an incredibly satisfying read. It was a good discussion book.
I hadn't finished it by the time we spoke about it on the podcast. I don't think I admitted that at the time.
I don't think you did either.
But this never happens. I actually went back and finished it and really, really enjoyed it.
Peggy Guggenheim's section is very strong, which is the 3rd section of the book, yeah. So that's it, is it?
Well, it is it in terms of episodes that have been released so far. And if you're interested in any of those books, you will find them on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts.
Lovingly crafted and sitting there waiting for you.
But there is one more that we have recorded, and it will be coming out in the next week or 2, and that is Lullaby by Leila Slemani.
Laura's favourite read of 2018. Oh, so it's a little spoiler there.
You had read it before my book club did.
It's a short, sharp, shocking novel by a French author that was incredibly successful in France. It won the Prix Goncourt, and then it's been translated and has done very well over here. And it tells the story of a nanny who ends up murdering the 2 small children that she's looking after. And this is not a surprise. You know this. It's actually on the cover of the book. The baby is dead. It took only a few seconds. So you always know what's going to happen. And the drama really is in how and why things got to this point. And she depicts the lives of the couple who hire this nanny, and the nanny Louise, who's the sort of seemingly perfect French lady who's very
doll-like,
but has a sort of magical ability to make their lives sort of beautiful and effortless. All the little domestic tasks that were really grinding them down, she takes on and does beautifully, and she plays wonderfully with children, and they're always immaculately turned out, and the birthday parties are hugely successful, and everything seems so easy on the surface. And yet what is going on underneath?
And it's that contrast, I think, between the beautiful life that Louise creates for this family and the bleak existence she has on the fringes of Paris, grappling with debt and decay in her flat and isolation and loneliness. And there's this real fear that she's going to lose the family. And we talk a lot on the podcast coming up about that relationship between nannies and parents and children.
Yes, it's primarily the relationship between the nanny and the mother. and the nanny and the role of nanny, someone who's hired to, in some ways, replace that mother. And then the mother is correspondingly displaced, even though she's then able to go out and enjoy a certain amount of freedom as a result of this relationship. But, I think to any listeners who haven't read it and listening to that description are thinking, why would anybody want to read a book like this?
Yes, why would they? I just don't know.
First of all, it is incredibly well written, and I thought the writing in itself justified it. But secondly, it's incredibly thoughtful about some very interesting issues to do with contemporary motherhood, the idea of a sort of chain of caretaking, the idea that if we want to supposedly have it all, and go out and have fabulous careers and also have a beautiful home and have happy, thriving children, we have to get someone else to help us, and we have to outsource a lot of that work, and that there's someone always at the end of the chain who's at the bottom. And this book explores that in a really interesting way. It's unforgettable, I would say. And I felt very much I had sort of learned from it and somehow grown as a person. I don't know, that sounds a weird phrase, but, it changed me reading that book. And to me, those are the real gems. I love it when books like that come along. Others may not agree. You'll have to listen in. It's a great episode, actually. I'm excited about it.
Indeed. And I probably shouldn't say too much, or I will spoil the episode.
Yeah.
However, I may have indicated my feelings, so you'll just have to see how that went down with my book club.
Yeah. So that is a great stack of books and some great reads. But
and I'm quite proud of the list, just incidentally.
Yeah.
We read a lot of women writers this year. We read a lot of non-mainstream narratives, I guess could be the phrase. I'm awfully terrible in my sort of woke language.
I feel like your book club are always a little bit more considered about your choices than mine. Mine, we tend to just very much be swayed by if someone happens to have read a review of something, or I don't know, it always feels like with us it's we're quite easy, we just sort of, we'll read that, no one has ever really, really, really thought about it in advance.
Well, I made the mistake of saying on the podcast that I often steer the decisions of my book club, naively
did
thinking.
They hear you say that?
Yes, they did, and they've definitely brought that up the last few times we've chosen books, which I'm sure is all for the good. That's how we read Lullaby by Leila Slemani.
I mean, this is the joy of book clubs. It gets you to read things that you wouldn't normally read. People who love to read, that's great, but you're always going to be reading according to your inclination. And that's never going to take you out of your comfort zone. If you're only choosing books that you think you'll like, which is a totally reasonable way to go from book to book, but you're not going to explore genres that you might never read, or voices that you might never hear. And I think there's a lot of great things about books with Philippe Sands.
Also Jane Bowles, but
Yes, my life would very much be the poorer if I hadn't read Jane Bowles.
So then what would you say was the best book club book of 2018?
For me, I would say my best book club book of 2018 was Educated by Tara Westover. I gave it some thought and I thought, you know what? That was just the perfect package. It wasn't too long. It was a fascinating story. It was beautifully written. It totally took me out of my world and into hers. And somehow it's very satisfying. It's it's got a really pleasing arc that's sort of inspiring, and you finish it feeling hopeful. And yeah, it was a great discussion book.
I was very tempted by Educated. However, I think East West Street by Philippe Sands trumps it for me. I take your point. It is long, and that subtitle is going to put a lot of people off, but I don't care. If your book club reads it, or if you just read it as an individual, you will be, I want to say delighted, but that's not the right word. You will be overwhelmed. I'm not even sure. It's just such an incredible book, and it is a page turner, and you will have a ton to discuss. Again, I wasn't there. It's funny that we both chosen books that we weren't there for.
Yeah, that's true.
Take that for what you will, listeners. I think, and funnily enough, those are both nonfiction books too, which isn't what I would expect.
Yes, that's funny. Because Educated almost reads like a novel, but it's not. I think East West Street does feel like nonfiction.
It does, but it has that mystery, how's it all going to end element to it that really keeps you gripped.
So yeah, there you go. Not one, but two
book club books.
Book club books
of 2018.
You heard it here first.
That's all for this episode. On our next episode, we'll be discussing Lullaby by Leila Slemani, the best-selling French thriller you'll have heard us discuss earlier in the episode. It's the latest book read by my book club, and it's a tense, deftly written novel about the perfect nanny's transition into a monster. Did it make for a good book club book? You've had a bit of teaser here today, but you'll have to listen in to the next episode to find out. And if you missed it, do check out our latest interview with Jim West of the Paperbacks, an all-male book club based out of North Vancouver that got its start at the ice hockey rink.
Now, listeners, have you just read something that would make for a brilliant book club book? What's the best thing your book club has ever read? What's the worst? Write in and let us know, and we'll feature you on the show. Drop us a line at thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, or on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod. And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts?
But for now, thanks for listening, happy reading, Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year.